The law of the frontier is simple. The strong survive, and the weak are buried. But in the dust-choked town of Redemption Creek, a different kind of law was written in the shadows, the law of greed, wielded by one man. This is the story of Arabella, a woman with nothing left to lose, branded an outcast by the town she tried to serve. When a brutal storm brings a dying man to her doorstep, she's forced to make a choice. He's an outlaw, a Comanche, a man her town would hang. Saving him could be her death warrant, but it might also be her only salvation. The dust in Redemption Creek never settled. It was a permanent fifth resident in every home, a gritty seasoning in every meal, a fine brown shroud over every dream. For Arabella Fry, the dust was a constant reminder of her isolation. Her small homestead, a clinker cabin made of rough-hewn pine and mud plaster, wasn't even in the town proper. It sat a half-mile out, perched precariously on the edge of a dry arroyo, the last stop between the civilized world and the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Comancheria. Arabella was a pariah, and she knew it. It had an example. Her father, a good man, with a bad love for a silver-lowed rumor, had dragged them here, filled her head with promises of San Francisco silks, and left her with nothing but a played-out claim and a mountain of debt at the general store. When he'd succumbed to a lung fever 2 winters back, the town's pity had lasted exactly as long as the funeral service. Now, at 24, she was that Fry woman, a spinster, by frontier standards too poor to be courted, and too proud to be a charity case. She survived. She tended her meager garden, fighting the alkali soil for every stunted carrot. She mended torn shirts for the freighters passing through her fingers, nimble and her prices low. She sold bitterroot tonics to the saloons, soiled doves, who in their own way were the only folk who treated her with a shred of decency. But it was a half-life, a grey existence, measured out in handfuls of flour and the judgmental stares of the town's respectable women. The epicenter of that judgment, and indeed the epicenter of all power in Redemption Creek, was Bartholomew Bart Shaw. Shaw owned the Triple S Ranch, which sprawled across 50,000 acres of the best water rights in the county. He owned the saloon, the general store, and thus Arabella's debt and the livery. He was a big man, not just in wealth, but in physical presence. He filled a doorway, his expensive wool vest perpetually strained over a prosperous belly, his face always clean-shaven and smelling of bay rum, a strange, cloying scent in the dusty air. He was, by all accounts, a town builder, a pillar of the community. But when his gaze fell on Arabella during her rare trips to the store, it wasn't civic-minded. It was possessive. It was the same look he gave a prize mare he intended to buy, a look that stripped her bare and calculated her worth. "Miss Arabella," he'd rumbled just last week, his voice a low vibration that made her skin crawl. He'd cornered her by the flour barrels. "A woman alone out on the flats. It's not safe. All sorts of unwanted elements out there." "I manage Mr. Shaw," she'd said, her voice tight, refusing to meet his eyes. "Managing is not living," he'd said, his thumb hooking into his vest pocket. "I've been thinking about your father's debt, a sizable sum. The bank in Austin is getting impatient." He was the bank, or as good as. "I will pay it," she said, her cheeks burning with shame. "Of course you will." He'd smiled, but it didn't reach his cold grey eyes. "But a woman like you shouldn't be worrying your pretty head over finances. You should be protected. I could offer you that protection." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the dust. He wanted her. But more than that, he wanted her land. Her small, worthless-looking plot was the only private claim bordering the arroyo, which, as her father had always sworn, became a river for 2 months a year. Shaw wanted that water. He wanted to own everything from the mountains to the plains, and Arabella was a small, stubborn weed in his path. She had refused politely but firmly, and had fled the store, her heart pounding a rhythm of fear and defiance. That had been 3 days ago. Now a storm was brewing. Not a rainstorm, those were blessings, but a duster. The sky to the north had turned a sickly greenish yellow, a roiling wall of grit and topsoil that was bearing down on Redemption Creek like a freight train. Arabella worked with frantic, practiced efficiency. She wrestled the wooden shutters closed, banging them against the warped frames and dropping the heavy bars into place. She stuffed rags into the cracks under the door and around the window sashes. She brought in her 3 scrawny chickens, caging them by the cold hearth. The wind began to howl a high-pitched demonic keen that seemed to come from the earth itself. The cabin plunged into darkness as the sun was obliterated. The world shrank to the 4 walls of her home. The wind screamed. The fine, choking dust began to seep in, inevitable as death. It coated her tongue, her eyes. She sat on her small cot, a damp cloth held over her nose and mouth, and listened to the world being torn apart outside. It was in the darkest, most terrifying hour of the storm, as the cabin shuddered and groaned under the assault, that she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was a thump. A human-sized thump against the back wall near the woodpile, followed by a low, agonizing groan that was almost stolen by the wind. Arabella froze. Her blood turned to ice. Shaw's words echoed in her head. All sorts of unwanted elements. Bandits. A drunk freighter. She waited, her breath held. The wind shrieked, and then in a momentary lull she heard it again. A desperate, wet cough. Every instinct of self-preservation, every lesson the frontier had taught her, screamed at her to stay inside, to bar the door, to pretend she was deaf. This was not her business. Bringing trouble in was a good way to get killed. But her father, for all his faults, had not raised a coward. And her mother, gone so long ago, had raised a Christian. You don't let a man die in a ditch. She could almost hear her mother's voice, even if he's the devil himself. Cursing her own conscience, Arabella grabbed her father's old heavy Colt revolver from the mantel. Her hand shaking, she pulled her shawl tight, lifted the bar on the back door, and stepped out into the apocalypse. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. It was like stepping into a solid wall of grit. The world was gone, replaced by a screaming, suffocating vortex of brown. She could barely see her own feet. "Hello," she shouted, the word instantly ripped from her mouth. She kept one hand on the rough log wall of the cabin, inching her way toward the woodpile. The dust stung her eyes, blinding her. She tripped over a loose log and fell to her knees, the Colt flying from her grasp. Panic seized her. She was blind, unarmed, and at the mercy of the storm and whatever was in it. Then she heard the cough again, just feet away. Scrambling on her hands and knees, her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't be there. It wasn't wood. It was leather, and it was wet. She fumbled her hands, finding a shoulder, a torso. A man. He was slumped against the woodpile, half buried in a drift of dust and tumbleweeds. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp. "Get up!" she yelled, pulling at his arm. "You have to get up, I can't carry you!" He didn't respond. He was either unconscious or too far gone. He was heavy, a dead weight. Desperation gave her a surge of adrenaline. She hooked her arms under his, planting her feet, and pulled. He slid. She dragged him an inch at a time, the few feet back to the cabin door, the storm fighting her every step. She tumbled inside with him, falling over the threshold and landing hard on the packed earth floor. She kicked the door shut, fumbled for the bar, and slammed it into place, sealing them in. For a moment, she just lay there gasping, her lungs on fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was pitch black, the only sound her own ragged breathing and the muffled scream of the wind and the wet, hitching breath of the man she had just dragged in. Her hands shook so badly she could barely strike a match. The small flame wavered, then caught on the wick of her kerosene lamp. She turned it up, and the dim, oily light flooded the tiny room. Arabella's breath caught in her throat. She slowly rose to her feet, backing away, until she hit the far wall. He wasn't a freighter. He wasn't a bandit. He was Comanche. His long black hair was matted with blood and mud. His features, though pale and drawn with pain, were undeniably native. He wore beaded leather leggings and a tattered, blood-soaked shirt. His face, under the grime, was streaked with the faint, faded remnants of war paint. This was not an unwanted element. This was the boogeyman the town used to frighten its children. This was the savage the newspapers in Austin screamed about, the reason the army built forts, the mortal enemy of everything she knew. Helping a white man was dangerous. Harboring a Comanche, that was a hanging offense. No trial, no judge, just a rope and the nearest sturdy tree. She looked at the man on her floor. He looked young, maybe her age. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of agony. He was dying. A dark, oozing stain was spreading from his side. He'd been shot. It looked bad, the kind of gut-shot wound that left a man screaming for days before it finally took him. Arabella's mind raced. She could drag him back out, let the storm take him. By morning, he'd be just another mound of dust. No one would ever know. It was the smart thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. She looked at the door, then she looked at him. His eyes flickered open. They weren't the demon's eyes the dime novels described. They were just eyes. Dark, cloudy with pain, and utterly exhausted. He looked at her, and in that gaze she saw no malice, no savagery. She just saw a man who knew he was dying. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He just looked at her. And then his eyes rolled back and his head lolled to the side. "Damn you!" Arabella whispered to him. To God, to her own stubborn heart. She grabbed her sewing scissors. She grabbed the whiskey bottle she kept for medicinal purposes. She tore a strip from her cleanest company sheet, the one she'd been saving for a life that was never going to happen. She knelt beside him. "You're not dying in my cabin." She muttered as much to herself as to him. "I'll not have the stench of it." She cut away the tattered, bloody leather. The wound was horrific, a ragged, weeping hole in his left side just above the hip. It was hot to the touch and already smelled of infection. He'd been shot, and it looked like the bullet was still in there. She was not a doctor. She was a mender of shirts, but she'd seen her father through his fever. She'd set a chicken's wing. She knew what rot looked like, and this was it. "This is going to hurt," she said, mostly to steady her own nerves. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto the torn sheet. "And if you wake up and try to scalp me, I'll shoot you myself. I swear it." She pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth to the wound. The man's body arched off the floor with a silent, strangled scream. His eyes flew open wide with a pure, animalistic agony. His hand, fast as a snake, shot out and gripped her wrist. His grip was iron. Pain had given him a last, terrible strength. He stared at her, his dark eyes blazing. Arabella didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She met his gaze, her own pale, terrified and utterly resolute. "I am trying to help you," she hissed through gritted teeth. For a long, terrible moment, they were frozen. The outlaw and the outcast, locked in a battle of wills, the storm screaming around them. He searched her face, looking for what deceit fear. He saw the fear, it was plain enough. but he also saw the stubborn set of her jaw. Slowly, agonizingly, his grip loosened. His hand fell away. His body slumped back to the floor, and he mercifully passed out again. Arabella let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her entire body trembling. She picked up the cloth, took a deep breath, and went back to work. The storm raged for 2 full days, sealing the cabin from the outside world. It was a strange, suffocating limbo. Outside, the world had been erased. Inside, there was only the sound of the wind, the stinging smell of dust and kerosene, and the low, fevered breathing of the man on her floor. Arabella worked tirelessly. She'd managed to probe the wound with her father's sterilized fishing knife, a horrifying, bloody business that had left her pale and shaking, and had pulled out a misshapen piece of lead, a .44 caliber slug. Not army issue, a settler's or a rancher's gun. She cleaned the wound again and again with boiled water and the last of her whiskey. She packed it with a poultice of yarrow and willow bark remedies her mother had taught her. She forced water and later thin broth between his cracked, fevered lips. He was a ghost hovering between life and death. He thrashed in his fever, muttering in a language she didn't understand, guttural, clipped, and full of a pain that went deeper than the bullet hole. In his delirium, he was fighting. His hands would clench his muscles, tensing as if he were drawing a bow. She sat with him, cooling his forehead with damp rags, holding him down when his nightmares threatened to tear her stitches open. She was exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone with this dangerous secret. And she learned his face. Stripped of the blood and war paint, he was just a man, younger than she'd first thought. His features were strong, a high-bridged nose, and a square, stubborn jaw. A long, thin scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently severe look. But in the vulnerability of his fever, his face was smooth, almost boyish. She found herself wondering about him. What was his name? Who had shot him? Did he have a wife? A child? These were dangerous, humanizing thoughts. He was supposed to be a monster, a red devil. But the man who'd grabbed her wrist was gone. In his place was just a patient one who depended on her for every drop of water, for every moment of life. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally died. The silence was as shocking as the noise had been. Arabella unbarred the door and stepped out into a world transformed. The landscape was scoured, reshaped into new alien drifts of dust. Her small garden was buried. Her water barrel was empty. But the sky was a brilliant, aching blue. She was hauling what looked like half the county's topsoil out of her cabin when she turned and found him watching her. He was awake. And he was lucid. He had pushed himself up to a sitting position, his back against the wall, her grandmother's quilt drawn up to his waist. His black eyes were clear, sharp, and intensely alert. The fever was broken. They stared at each other for a long moment. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. "You speak English?" she asked, her voice raspy. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a short, curt nod. "Good," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. She gestured to the empty pot of broth. "Because I'm out of food, and I'm out of whiskey, and I have a debt at the general store that I can't pay because I spent 2 days saving your life instead of mending shirts." She hadn't meant to say all that. It just came out a torrent of exhaustion and fear. A flicker of something surprise amusement passed over his face. His voice, when it came, was a low, rough-textured rasp, as if he hadn't used it in days, which she supposed he hadn't. "My name is Koa." He said it slowly, testing the words. "Arabella," she replied. Arabella Fry. Arabella. He repeated, tasting the name. He nodded as if committing it to memory. He looked down at his side, where the clean white bandages were wrapped tightly. He touched them, his long fingers tracing the outline of her work. Then he looked back at her. "Why?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct, it disarmed her. "Why what? Why?" he repeated, gesturing to the bandages to the cabin. "I am Comanche. You are white." He said the word without malice, as a simple fact. "Your people would hang you for this." She flinched. He wasn't wrong. I don't know," she said, and it was the honest truth. "You were dying. It was the storm, She sighed, brushing a strand of dusty hair from her face. "You don't let a man die on your doorstep. Not even—" She didn't finish. "Not even you." He understood. A dark, knowing look passed over his face. He knew exactly what she was. An outcast. He, an outcast from one world, had been saved by an outcast from another. For the next 4 days, a strange, silent routine developed. Koa healed at an astonishing rate. The wound that would have killed a lesser man was already closing. He was strong, his body honed by a life she couldn't imagine. They rarely spoke. But in the silence, a new language formed. He would watch her as she worked her hands, chapped and red, expertly patching a pair of canvas trousers. She would watch him as he sat in the sun by the door, his eyes on the horizon, as still and patient as the mountains themselves. He was clean. She had given him her father's old razor, and he had shaved, revealing the strong lines of his face. He'd washed his hair in the arroyo, and it hung black and shining to his shoulders. He was beautiful in a way that was wild and dangerous, and made her feel things she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Then on the 5th day, the trouble she had been dreading finally arrived. She heard the horses first. 2 riders coming fast from town. Koa was on his feet in an instant, his patient demeanor vanishing like smoke. He moved with a lithe, predatory grace, his eyes scanning for a weapon. "Where?" Arabella hissed, grabbing her own Colt. "Under the floor," he said, his voice a low command. He pointed to a loose-set trap door in her floor, a small root cellar her father had dug. "The dust. Cover it." She didn't question him. He grabbed her father's knife, the one she'd used on him, and slipped into the dark, cramped hole. Arabella wrestled the heavy plank door back into place, kicking dust and a raggedy mat over it, just as a heavy fist hammered on her door. "Arabella Fry, open this door. This is Sheriff Brody." Her heart leapt into her throat. She took a deep breath, composed her face into a mask of weary annoyance, and opened the door. Sheriff Brody stood on her step, a paunchy, sweating man who lived in permanent fear of his own shadow. And standing next to him, his bulk blocking out the sun, was Bart Shaw. Shaw's eyes weren't on her. They were scanning the inside of her cabin, sharp and assessing. He sniffed the air. "Good morning, Sheriff. Mr. Shaw," Arabella said, her voice admirably steady. "What can I do for you?" "Miss Arabella," Brody began, nervously twisting his hat brim. We're just checking on the outlying homesteads after the duster, to see if you're all right. As you can see, Sheriff, I'm fine. The storm was just a storm." Shaw's gaze was piercing. He took a step into the cabin, uninvited. Arabella had to step back or be run over. He looked around the small, tidy room. His eyes lingered on the table where 2 tin cups sat. "You've had company," Shaw stated. It wasn't a question. Arabella's blood ran cold. She'd washed Koa's cup, but hadn't put it away. I like a lot of coffee, Mr. Shaw," she stammered. Shaw smiled, that cold, reptilian smile. "Of course you do." His eyes moved from the cup to the floor, as if he could smell the man hiding beneath his feet. We heard. Rumors, Miss Arabella. My ranch hands at the north pasture. They said they were tracking a Comanche raiding party before the storm. Shot one, they think, but the rest got away. He took a step closer to her. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you? Any stragglers? Anyone who doesn't belong out here? He was so close, she could smell the bay rum and the faint, sour scent of his cigar. His gaze was heavy, violating, and beneath the floor, not 2 feet from Shaw's expensive leather boots, she knew Koa was listening, knife in hand. Arabella's mind spun, searching for a lie that would hold water, but looking into Bart Shaw's cold, knowing eyes, she realized he wasn't asking a question. He was setting a trap. He wanted her to lie. No, Mr. Shaw, she said, her voice miraculously even. I haven't seen anyone. As you said, a woman alone. I keep my door barred. Shaw's smile widened, but it held no warmth. Wise. Very wise. He glanced around the cabin one last time, his eyes lingering on the ragged mat covering the cellar door. He knew, or he suspected, which was just as bad. He was a predator who had scented blood, and whether he truly believed it was a Comanche, or just any man, it was a sign of weakness in her he could exploit. Well, he said, turning to the door, good to see you're unharmed. He paused, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Don't forget about our little talk, Miss Arabella. That debt at the store, it's patient, but it's not immortal. Come on, Brody. He swept out of the cabin, the nervous sheriff stumbling in his wake. Arabella stood, frozen, her entire body shaking as she watched them mount their horses and ride away. Only when they were a small, dust-shrouded dot on the horizon did she bolt the door and collapse against it. She wrestled the trapdoor open. Koa emerged, not panicked, but coiled. His face was like a thundercloud. He knows, she whispered, her voice trembling. He suspects. Koa corrected his dark eyes, fixed on the door, as if he could still see Shaw's retreating form. He is a man who likes to own things. He thinks he owns you. He owns my debt, she said bitterly. It's the same thing. No, Koa said, turning to her. His intensity was startling. It is not. He looked at his mended side. He was healed. Not fully, but he could ride. The unspoken pact they'd made in the storm was over. It was no longer safe for him here. It was no longer safe for her to have him here. He went to the corner where his meager, tattered belongings lay. He dressed his movements fluid and efficient. He was a different person from the fevered man she had tended. This was a warrior, a leader. He strapped the knife she had given him to his belt. He stood before her, a powerful, self-contained force in her tiny, fragile cabin. You are not safe with him, Koa said. And I'm not safe with you, she retorted, the fear and exhaustion making her sharp. Or because of you. He'll be back, Koa. He thinks I'm lying. I must go, he said, not unkindly. My people will be looking for me. Then go, she snapped, turning away so he couldn't see the sudden sharp sting of tears. She was terrified, and his leaving made her feel a new kind of alone, a rawer, more dangerous isolation than before. He walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the wooden bar. He turned, and his face was for a moment unguarded. He reached into a small leather pouch on his belt, one she hadn't noticed before. He pulled something out and pressed it into her hand. It was a single, intricately beaded feather. Small, black, and tied with a leather thong. It was beautiful, and it felt impossibly soft. For the debt, he said. Arabella stared at it. A feather, Koa, this won't pay for flour. This won't stop Bart Shaw. He will come for you, Koa said, ignoring her. His voice was grim. "But he will not have you." And then, with the silence of a shadow, he was gone. He slipped out the back door, and when she ran to the window to watch him go, he had already vanished into the landscape of rock and arroyos, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Arabella was left with a pounding heart, the lingering scent of bay rum, and a useless, beautiful feather. For a week, nothing happened. The silence from the town was more unnerving than Shaw's threats. Arabella's life returned to its bleak routine, but now it was poisoned with a new, potent fear. Every gust of wind sounded like a horseman. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Bart Shaw. She found herself clutching the small feather which she now wore on a thong around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, a talisman against a world that had no patience for such things. The other shoe dropped as it always did on a Tuesday. She was in the general store trying to trade a mended saddlebag for a small tin of coffee when Sheriff Brody walked in. He wasn't alone. He had 2 deputies with him, rough-looking men from Shaw's S ranch, wearing hastily pinned-on badges. "Arabella Fry." Brody announced, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet store. He cleared his throat, unable to meet her eyes. "Sheriff," she said, her stomach tightening. "Ma'am, I have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp went through the store. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, dropped a can of beans. "Arrest!" Arabella's voice was a small squeak. "For what?" "For debt. You can't arrest someone for debt." "It ain't for debt, ma'am," Brody said, his face flushing a deep mottled red. He pulled out a piece of paper. It's for theft, and for aiding and abetting a fugitive of the law." "What?" She was bewildered. That's ridiculous. Aiding who?" Bart Shaw emerged from the back office, as if on cue. He was holding something in his hand. He held it up for the whole store to see. It was a U.S. Army issue repeater rifle. "My men found this," Shaw said, his voice booming with false sorrow. "Found it in a dry gulch, not 100 yards from your cabin, Miss Fry, along with 3 of my best steers slaughtered. The trail, it led right back to your property." Arabella's blood turned to ice. It was a lie, a complete brazen fabrication. "But that's not the worst of it," Shaw continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "This rifle, it was stolen. Stolen from the army post at Fort Sill. And who steals army rifles, folks? Comanche," someone whispered. "Exactly." Shaw nodded, his eyes locking on Arabella. "She was hiding him. The one my men shot. Hiding him right in her cabin, feeding him, tending his wounds, feeding him my stolen beef." The store turned on her. The faces that had been indifferent before were now twisted with a righteous, hungry fury. "Comanche lover? Traitor! She brought this on us." "This is a lie!" Arabella shrieked, backing away. "He's lying. Bart Shaw wants my land. He's—" "That's enough, Miss Fry," Brody said, grabbing her arm. His grip was rough. "You're under arrest." "You can't," she cried, but the deputies were already on her. They dragged her, kicking and struggling, out of the store and into the dusty main street. The entire town was watching. They'd been led. They'd been shepherded here to watch her humiliation. They threw her into the town's single-cell jail, a squat, filthy adobe structure behind the sheriff's office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, the iron bar dropping into place with a sickening final thud. Arabella fell to the straw-covered floor, the stench of stale whiskey and human despair filling her lungs. She was trapped. Shaw had done it. He hadn't just threatened her. He had ruined her. He had turned the entire town against her. And he had done it with a lie so perfect, so terrible that the truth didn't stand a chance. The cell was a 6-by-8-foot box of misery. A sliver of moon through the single-barred window provided the only light. The straw on the floor was crawling with things she didn't want to identify. A single bucket in the corner completed the furnishings. Arabella sat on the rickety cot, her body numb with shock. It had happened so fast. In the space of 10 minutes, she had gone from being a pariah to being a criminal, a traitor. The charge of aiding a fugitive was vague, but Comanche lover was a death sentence in this territory. She knew with chilling certainty that she would never see a real trial. Judge Coltrane, the only law in a 100-mile radius, was a notorious drunk who was kept on Shaw's payroll. He would sentence her based on whatever Shaw told him to. And the town would cheer. They needed a scapegoat for their fears, for the drought, for the Indian trouble, and she had just been handed to them on a platter. She was going to hang, or worse, be run out of town with nothing, only to die in the wilderness. She spent the night in a haze of terror. Every sound from the street made her jump. She thought of Koa. Had he made it? Was he safe? A bitter, hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. She had saved him, and in doing so, had damned herself. The irony was so thick it was choking. The morning brought a new, more personal kind of horror. The bar on her cell door lifted. It wasn't Brody. It was Bart Shaw. He entered the cell bringing his scent of bay, rum, and cigars into the squalor. He was holding a tin plate with a piece of bread and a cup of water. He placed it on the floor, as if feeding an animal. "Good morning, Arabella," he said, his voice offensively pleasant. She said nothing, just stared at him with all the hatred she possessed. "Not hungry?" he chuckled. "I wouldn't be either. The food Judge Coltrane serves at the gallows is lacking, I'm told." He leaned against the wall, filling the tiny cell with his bulk. "It's a shame, really. A crying shame. A beautiful young woman like you, all twisted up, helping those red animals. Task. You know I did no such thing," she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. "You planted that rifle. You stole your own cattle." Shaw actually laughed. "Planted stolen Arabella. Those are such ugly words. I call it business. I'm protecting the interests of this town, and you became a liability. You want my land. I will have your land," he corrected her, "one way or another. Your signature on a deed of sale or your signature on a death warrant. It's all the same to the bank in Austin." He stepped closer, and her stomach revolted. "But it doesn't have to be this way," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble she so despised. "It really doesn't." He reached out and stroked a strand of her matted hair. She flinched, but there was nowhere to retreat. "I am a lonely man, Arabella. A man of appetites. A man like me needs a wife, a strong woman, a beautiful woman to stand by his side, to manage his household." She understood. The blood drained from her face. "Marry me," he said. It wasn't a proposal, it was a threat. You are insane," she whispered. "I'm practical," he countered. "Here is the deal. You sign 2 pieces of paper. The first is a deed transferring your little clinker claim to the S Ranch. The second is a marriage certificate. In return, I have a change of heart. I find the real thief." He smiled. "I'm sure one of my ranch hands, a half-wit named Peterson, will be only too happy to confess in exchange for a lighter sentence. I'll even pay off your father's debt. Wiped clean. You will go from being a prisoner to being Mrs. Bartholomew Shaw, the First Lady of Redemption Creek." He was offering her a new cage, a gilded one, but a cage all the same. She would be his property, just like her land, just like the saloon, trapped, owned, and at his mercy. And if I say no, she asked, her heart a cold dead stone in her chest. Shaw's smile vanished. The civility dropped away, revealing the raw, ugly predator beneath. If you say no, then Judge Coltrane will be here at noon. He will expedite your trial, given the sensitivity of the crime, and by sundown you will be a lesson to anyone who ever thinks of defying me. The town will watch, and I will own your land anyway. The bank will see to it. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip tightening like a vice. This is your last chance, Arabella. My protection, or the rope. It's your choice. She looked at his face, the smug certainty, the raw hunger. She thought of a life as his wife, waking up to that face, enduring his touch, being his thing, and she thought of the rope. In that moment, they almost seemed the same. I need to think, she whispered, a delaying tactic. You have 1 hour, he said, his good humor restored. He patted her shoulder, a gesture of ownership that made her skin burn. I'll have Judge Coltrane draw up the papers. It's so much tidier this way, don't you think? He left, and she heard the bar drop a sound as final as a coffin nail. 1 hour. 1 hour to choose between a fast death and a slow one. She sank onto the cot. There was no escape. Shaw had sealed every exit. He had won. She reached for the cup of water. Her hand was shaking so badly she spilled half of it. As she drank, her fingers fumbled at her neck beneath her dress. Her fingers closed around the small beaded feather. Koa. A forgotten ember of hope flickered. He will come for you, but he will not have you. She dismissed it. It was a foolish, romantic notion. He was one man likely 100 miles away, fighting for his own survival. He wasn't coming. No one was coming. She was alone, and her hour was almost up. She sat up, her spine straight. She thought of her father. She thought of her mother. And she thought of Bart Shaw's sweaty, possessive hands. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not sign. She would face the rope. It was a terrible choice, but it was hers. It was the last tiny piece of herself that Bart Shaw could not own. She closed her eyes and waited for the sound of the judge's footsteps. The saloon was packed. It wasn't just a trial, it was a town event. Bart Shaw, generous in his victory, had ordered a free barrel of whiskey, and the mood was dangerously festive. Judge Coltrane, his face a web of broken blood vessels, sat behind a makeshift bench, a plank of wood laid over 2 barrels. He was already half drunk, his judicial robes stained with tobacco. Arabella stood before him, flanked by Shaw's 2 thuggish deputies. Her hands were bound in front of her. She was pale, her dress torn, but her head was high. She had made her choice. She would not beg. Now, folks, let's have order. Coltrane slurred, banging a gavel that was really just a whiskey bottle. We are here to dispense, justice. Bart Shaw stood near the front, a picture of civic-minded sorrow. Judge Orr, he said, his voice carrying over the din. It is with a heavy heart that I bring this tragedy to your attention. The evidence, as you know, is overwhelming. Indeed, Coltrane muttered, shuffling a pile of papers he clearly hadn't read. Arabella Fry, you are charged with theft of livestock conspiracy and, Comanche. A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. How do you plead? The judge asked, already looking to Shaw for his cue. She doesn't have to plead, Shaw said, stepping forward. We all know she's guilty. She was consorting with the very savages who burn our homes. The saloon doors at the far end of the room swung open with a bang that silenced him. Every head turned. The man who stood in the doorway was not a savage. Koa was not the wounded, feverish man she had saved. He was clean-dressed in a mix of practical Western gear, a dark shirt, canvas trousers, and the clear markings of a Comanche war leader. A polished bone-plate breastpiece covered his chest. 2 eagle feathers were braided into his long black hair. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was magnificent, and he was terrifying. But he was not alone. Behind him, fanned out in the street, were at least 20 men. They were a hard-bitten, dangerous-looking crew, a mix of Comanche warriors in full paint and leathers and what looked like Mexican vaqueros and white outlaws, all armed to the teeth. They didn't ride in shooting. They just sat on their horses, a silent, disciplined army, their rifles held casually across their saddles. They had, in an instant, taken control of the town without firing a shot. The saloon went dead silent. The only sound was the jingle of Koa's spurs as he walked slowly and deliberately down the center of the room. He didn't look at Shaw. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Arabella. He walked until he was standing directly in front of her. The 2 deputies had backed away their hands, hovering nervously near their guns, but they made no move to stop him. Koa's eyes took in her bound hands, the tear stain on her cheek, the defiant terror in her eyes. His own eyes, which had been as hard as obsidian, softened for just a fraction of a second. He reached out, and with the knife he'd taken from her cabin, he cleanly sliced the ropes binding her wrists. "This," Koa's voice cut through the silence, "is not yours to judge." "Now see here," Judge Coltrane sputtered, finding a sudden, whiskey-fueled courage. "You can't just... This is a court. That woman is a liar." Bart Shaw finally found his voice. He was shaking, not with fear, but with rage. His entire, carefully constructed world was being torn down by a man he considered a subhuman. "She's a traitor. And You're the one she saved. Seize him. He's the fugitive. Fugitive." Koa turned his head slowly to look at Shaw. It was the first time he had acknowledged him. "From you. My men shot you. You were rustling my cattle." Shaw screamed, his face purple. "Were they your cattle, Shaw?" Koa asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or were they the cattle you stole from the Triple C ranch in the valley? The ones you rebranded with your Triple S? The ones you've been driving to the army post and selling as your own, blaming the Comanche for the unfortunate losses?" Shaw's color drained. He went from purple to a pasty, sickly white. That's a damned lie." "Is it?" Koa asked. He snapped his fingers. One of his men, a tall vaquero with a scarred face, stepped into the saloon. He was carrying a heavy oilcloth-wrapped bundle. He dumped it on the judge's bench, scattering the papers and knocking over the whiskey bottle. The vaquero unrolled the bundle. Inside were 2 items. The first was a brand book. The second was a set of branding irons. One was a Triple C. The other was a Triple S, cleverly designed to be burned directly over the first, altering the brand. "My fugitive friend, Miguel Koa said, used to work for you, until you tried to have him accidentally killed when he learned too much. He has been keeping these for me." The town was silent, but it was a different silence now. It was the sound of dozens of people recalculating, the sound of loyalty shifting like the dust outside. "And," Koa continued, "the army is very interested in this. They don't like being overcharged by a thief, and they really don't like it when a man tries to start a war to cover his tracks." He took a step toward Shaw. "You have been poisoning this land. You have been poisoning this town. You tried to poison her." "Lies," Shaw roared. He was a cornered animal. All his plans, his power, his protection were evaporating. He did the only thing a man like him could do. He drew his gun. He was fast, but he was pulling a fancy pearl-handled revolver from a heavy leather holster. Koa didn't have a revolver. He moved not like a man, but like a whip crack. The knife that had freed Arabella was in his hand, and in a single fluid motion he threw it. The knife spun end over end and embedded itself with a sickening thunk into the heavy mahogany bar, pinning Shaw's gun hand and the gun to the wood. Shaw screamed a high-pitched, unmanly sound as his revolver clattered to the floor. He was trapped, nailed to his own bar. Koa didn't even look at him. He turned his back on the screaming, bleeding man. He turned to the stunned, silent town, and he turned to Arabella. The town of Redemption Creek held its collective breath. They had just witnessed the complete surgical dismantling of the man who had owned them, body and soul, for a decade. But Shaw, the pillar of their community, was now just a whimpering man nailed to his own bar. Koa walked back to Arabella. He ignored the gasping crowd, the terrified judge. He had eyes only for her. "I told you," he said, his voice low for her alone. "He would not have you. You came back," she whispered, her hands still tingling where the ropes had been. How did you know?" "I never left," Koa said. He gestured to the street. "Your sheriff is detained. My men have been watching this town for a week, waiting for him." He nodded at Shaw. "Waiting for him to show his true face." You set a trap," she realized, stunned. "You used me as bait." The accusation hung in the air. Koa's expression didn't flinch, but a flicker of something pained crossed his eyes. "Yes," he said, and the honesty of it hit her harder than a lie. "I knew he would come for you. It was the only way to make him show his hand in front of the fools who followed him. I didn't know he would arrest you. I was too slow." He looked at her bound wrists. "I am sorry for that." He was apologizing. This man who had just conquered a town was apologizing to her. "But what now?" she asked, looking around at the terrified faces. You can't just leave." "Oh," Koa said, and the barest hint of a smile touched his lips. "We are not finished." He whistled a sharp bird-like call. 2 more of his men walked in, hauling heavy leather saddlebags. They looked heavy. They walked to the judge's bench and unceremoniously dumped the contents. It wasn't a brand book. It was gold, not dust, not nuggets. Heavy, shining Spanish coins. French louis d'or, American double eagles. A king's ransom piled on the rickety plank. It was the sound of 100 years of dreams, a sound that cut through the fear like a hot knife. The town gasped. Judge Coltrane's eyes nearly popped out of his head. "This," Koa announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is payment." He picked up a single heavy coin. "Sure," he said, not looking at the whimpering man. "Stole more than just cattle. He stole trade. My trade." The twist, the final piece, settled into place. Koa wasn't just a warrior. He was a businessman. He controlled the secret trade routes through the Comanche, moving goods, cattle, and yes, gold from the Mexican territories up to the northern forts. He was a power broker, a leader, not just of a band of warriors, but of an enterprise. Shaw hadn't just been a rancher, he'd been a poacher on a king's territory. "This all best," Koa said, gesturing to the gold, "is for the town, for the debts Shaw held over you, for the store he bankrupted. This pays for it all." He was buying the town. He was liberating it, not with bullets, but with cold, hard cash. "And this," he said, picking up a smaller but still heavy pouch. He walked to Arabella and held it out to her. "This is for a debt, for whiskey, and broth. She looked at the bag. It contained more wealth than she had ever seen in her life, more than her father had died trying to find. It was enough to go anywhere. San Francisco, New York, London. It's too much, she stammered. It is not enough, he said simply. She looked at the gold. Then she looked at the terrified townspeople who were already eyeing the pile on the bench, their greed replacing their fear. She looked at the whimpering, ruined Bart Shaw, and she looked at her clinker cabin, her life of dust and mending and isolation. She could be rich. She could be just as alone as she was before. She slowly pushed the bag of gold back into Koa's hand. "It's not the gold I want," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Koa's eyes searched hers. He had come here to settle a score, to free her, to pay her. He hadn't come here for this. The one thing he hadn't planned for. "Arabella," he began. "My world. It is not your world. It is hard. It is dangerous." "So is this," she said with a bitter laugh, gesturing to the saloon. "At least your world is honest. And I am tired, so tired of dust." A slow, profound understanding passed between them. He had offered her freedom in the forms of justice and wealth. But she was asking for something more, something he hadn't known he had to offer. He nodded. Once. He held out his hand. Not with gold, just his hand. Arabella Fry, the pariah of Redemption Creek, took it. Koa turned his hand, holding hers, and together they walked out of the saloon. They didn't look back. They didn't look at the gold. They didn't look at the groveling, broken judge or the screaming, defeated tyrant. They walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the main street. Koa's men, the silent, waiting army, parted to let them through. A magnificent black stallion was brought forward. Koa mounted in one fluid motion, then reached down for Arabella. He pulled her up, seating her in front of him, as if she weighed nothing. She settled against his chest. It was hard, real. He was warm. She tucked the beaded feather which she had pulled from her dress back into her pocket. A down payment. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice almost lost in the wind that was already picking up. Koa looked not west toward the setting sun, but north toward the high, remote mountains that shimmered on the horizon. "Home," he said. And together they rode out of Redemption Creek, leaving nothing behind but the dust, a pile of gold, and a story that would be whispered in awe and in terror for generations. They were never ever seen again. Arabella Fry vanished from the pages of history, but her story, the legend of the woman who saved an outlaw and was saved in return, echoes in the canyons of the West. It's a story of how the line between savage and civilized is often just a line in the dust, drawn by greed and fear. What happens when you're pushed to the brink? Do you break, or do you find a strength you never knew you had? Arabella's choice proves that sometimes the greatest risk isn't in fighting, but in trusting. And the greatest reward isn't gold, but freedom. We tell these stories to remember that even in the most desperate of times, a single act of compassion can change the world. What did you think of Arabella's choice? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey into the wild, untamed past, be sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and subscribe for more tales of real-life drama and unexpected karma.